I'm just starting with these strangely old drawings of mine. In fact, Mr. Boyden here, sitting here, curated a show in Toronto when I was like 8 years old, and just out of grad school at Cranbrook. And it was a show that, I guess it's 1980, 86? I can't even recall. Maybe even earlier than that. So it was a show really just to put some work together, and just so I thought it would be interesting to know that the context of our foray, our kind of adventures into the digital realms, really goes back to, in the history books, to collage, at least for me, into the works of the surrealists, the Dadaists, the letterists, situationalists. I had a lot of these kind of interests in my head in grad school. And so as I started to work, I guess to leave grad school, I began to produce my own body of work. I produced these optographs, what we call optographs, which were just images of Paris under a kind of ocular lens, under some kind of distortion mechanism, a pre-digital distortion mechanism. The computer was in the air, but we hadn't seen any, and we didn't know what they were, and there was nowhere near a Mac or a PC for that matter that we could use. So this was really just cut and paste and good old-fashioned collage work, but to try and regroup Paris somehow through a series of optical procedures. And the idea was to do a kind of virtual, and I didn't use the word then, but a kind of virtual derive, three-dimensional derive of the Paris landscape. So these were these early paper collages and drawings. They were drafted, they were glued and pasted and cut. And it's interesting when I think back to these, because we couldn't scale. It was back to the what Max Ernst and everyone else dealt with, which was what you found, what you worked with. So there was maybe some Xeroxing, but for the most part it was objet trouvé and put into these collages. As we proceeded to work, we did a show at the Aidis Gallery in, I should know my dates, I think we're looking at 88. And the Aidis Gallery in Berlin was a very interesting place at the time, which was showing very young architects, like myself at the time. And we took the work and went one step further and created a machine, an abstract machine, called an optograph machine. It was based on a sort of, we had a dark room in the office in Manhattan, so we had this strange idea that we could go to Berlin in this case and photograph with our optical device what was underneath the Berlin Wall. So we produced these, about 50 of these drawings, or collages, or actually rayograph kind of technique. And what we did is we used the machine, we photographed Berlin where the wall was, we then brought the machine back to New York, we put it into the dark room, we then drew over the drawings and recombined them continually, and produced a large series of this work, which I can show you another time. It's in our first book. But these were the kind of, let's say, the kind of underbelly of what we thought was lingering beneath the Berlin Wall, because the Berlin Wall was there, and we thought it would be interesting. We then did get a computer in the office. Now we're looking at maybe 90, where we are now, 91, 90. And it was a very fast 386i with 16 megabytes of hard drive, and for the most part it was kind of a giant paperweight for us, because we really didn't know what to do with this machine. We had it there, we'd work with it, we'd produce drawings, and then the drawings were beautiful. We were fascinated by just watching the lines peel on the screen and arrive out of nowhere. So what we did is we took a Nikon camera and photographed the screen and produced these ectochrome slides, basically of the line work that we were fooling around trying to create, without really knowing. We were seduced by the beauty of the musicality of these lines, and then went and built one of our optical machines in the studio, and then projected the slides onto the machines and produced these things we call hyperfine splitting. And again, this was a large series of sebachrome prints we did. There's about 20 of them, and they're quite large, and they were printed in the studio because we had a color darkroom. And really all they were these experiments with optics, with light, with atmosphere, with aura, and really all being done in a kind of blissful naivete in terms of what the computer was going to allow us to do eventually. But again, the important thing about this was, and I told Greg this morning in our talk, that what's really interesting about most, let's say, well, overshooting by calling this avant-garde work. But what's interesting about a lot of avant-garde work is, if you look at it historically from where we sit, is that it's an anticipation of a future, of a desirous future. And in fact, the means by which to get there aren't necessarily there. If you can't afford the computer, you make it up. If you can't afford, a program at that time like Photoshop, you would figure out a way to make a fantasy about Photoshop, right, or something. So there was this kind of desperation to acquire this desirous thing called a computer that's somewhere out there, but we were too young, too poor, and too struggling architects that kind of anticipated its advent, and so we would produce these works out of this kind of glee and this kind of euphoria of potential. Well, computing came in to the studio. It also came into Columbia University, where Greg Lynn and I were. Actually, my story, there's a number of stories on this, but what happened to me was, I just told Reinhold this, is that I was working with students on video installations. Now, the other side of this obsession of mine personally with collage space, atmospheric space, was also driven by media art. And I did a lot of installation pieces with my students at Columbia. We ran reviews with media, with sound recordings, with sort of reverb out of video cameras, whatever we could do to produce a kind of flux-like environments. Again, in anticipation of augmented environments, but with the means that we had at our disposal. So when I was teaching one of those studios, I had two students come up to me and say they'd like to bring in their computers into the studio, and they were Mac 2 CIs. And I looked at these little objects and thought, oh, they're kind of cute, but I don't know what we're going to do with them, quite frankly. And then I went to Bernard Tschumi, who's here tomorrow, and said to Bernard, I have two students who want to bring two computers in the school. Is that okay? Do I need to sign some paperwork? Is there some kind of liability thing? And he says, let's see, it's my Bernard invitation. And the next thing I knew, we had Silicon Graphics signed on, and Apple, and Softimage, I think from Montreal, Toronto, Alias. And we had sponsorship, and the next thing you knew, Greg and I were asked to kick off two of the first paperless studios. And we dubbed them paperless really quite, overtly, because we wanted to do everything without paper, without the drawing tools we were used to using. I mean, the gleeful day in our office when we put our mail lines in the garbage was a fantastic day. But it took a while. And the reason that took a while is a little bit like the Abacus story in Hong Kong. The story in China, in Hong Kong at least, where people would go and buy things at that time when computers first arrived, and they would type it up on a computer, and then they would check it on the Abacus. It was that kind of problem for us with the mail line. We weren't quite sure we trusted the computing. But anyway, back to this. So we began the paperless studios in earnest, and I remember, and this is an anecdote that Greg, I remember there was a fate, well, two things. One thing is, I had predominantly women in my group. For whatever reason, luck of the draw, I had 9 women and 2 men in my studio. Greg had all men in his studio. Now, not only that, Greg was already into this, right? He was producing some interesting stuff early on. And so I remember when Bernard came up, maybe he can recount the story, I don't know, with the Silicon Graphics representative and the Alias or whomever it was. I remember him walking in the studio. Now, just to put that in context, when I looked over at Greg's studio, it looked like an incredibly efficient group of guys producing something. Not sure what they were doing, but it looked like maybe a jet fighter, maybe something militaristic, but whatever, they were very focused. My students, we went into atmospheric work. So I looked at my students as these sponsors came up with Bernard, and I looked over, and one of the women in my group was throbbing a cube on the screen with a soundtrack. And another student was doing some strange, like liquid kind of peeling off the screen. It was like, today maybe screensavers, but at that time this was super radical work, and for me at least. And it was very much about looking for a kind of phenomenological sort of, let's say, undercurrent to computing and digitalization. There was the premise of the brief at that time with my students was, it wasn't for me a formal tool or tool for formal manipulation. It was a tool for discussion and a kind of unraveling of phenomena, of possibility of spatial aberration, spatial change, I mean, for me, it was coming out of the media side and the collage side and the art kind of history. It was an amazing opportunity to actually, we could really warp space. We could really send new kinds of tonal symphonies into space, change atmospheres, change proportions, things like that. So that's what we were studying. Needless to say, Bernard beelined to Greg's group, and they all stood around some spinning model, and we all sat very kind of distraught on the other side of it. Anyway, point was that we finally ended up in Venice together, Greg and I, in the American Pavilion, him on one side, me on the other. And on his side was the milled work and so on. And on our side, we decided to produce these kind of environments, these digital environments. This environment was a room made of a technology called live wire, which is really a line with light in it. And we produced exact one-to-one version of the wireframe that we had produced in the machine into the space. And the idea was very basically that you could walk through the wireframe. This was pre-matrix. But you could walk into a kind of three-dimensional manifest spatiality, and that was what that room was all about. It was really, exploring the kind of musicality of computing, again, the atmospheric effects, the kind of distortions of space, the things that I still believe are in their infancy, actually, in terms of digital technologies with architects. But it was really a way of manifesting this into space. So, this was a super bad video. There were no iPhones, no 42 megapixel Nokias coming out tomorrow. This was a QuickTime movie. But it showed the live wire against a video projection of the same models in this kind of distortion field or distortion space. The soundtrack was really just the technology. And the idea was to really sort of have you kind of move through this multidimensional, ambiguous territory between screen projection or screen reality and a virtual reality that's actually manifest in the real space of the gallery of the American Pavilion. So this is what we had set up. We got an IBM sponsorship, which was very nice, and we produced 3 rooms at the Biennale. And in that was room number 2. In room number 1, we built this piece. And this piece was based on, actually I have better footage of this thing for the next one. It was based on taking an actual acrobat and having an acrobat do a full somersault in the actual space of the Biennale Pavilion itself. So we had an acrobat do the work. They were virtually puppeteered, sort of censored around their body. This is, again, wasn't so much the thing. It was just a kind of technology that was beginning to emerge in Hollywood that we thought would be interesting to use. And then map and construct one-to-one the actual, let's say, the choreography. And this goes back to Schwitter's and stick dance and even Duchamp knew descending a staircase. I mean, there's a lot of history in terms of those kinds of things. But the idea was to find an architectural equivalency or equivalent to that, and then build the structure, because the desire here was to, again, build this virtual space into it. And this is early on. We're talking 2000 here. And this was really a very kind of, is this the same one? Just from another angle, I think. So here you can see the mapping. I think this is the same film. And then every distortion that occurs according to the body moving through the space. Here in 3D, just again the same thing, just producing the wireframe distortion according to the actual human body. Now this is all kind of critical, at least in our own work, because it really started to talk about the fact that the anticipation, if I go back to what I said at the beginning about anticipating the next levels, even here, well over a decade ago, the anticipation was, that our augmented bodies, our virtual bodies, would become real conditions, and that there's going to be a kind of blurring, let's say, between virtual experience and a real experience, and that was what was at work here. So that's the actual construction in the space. It had a video sequence running on the back. You could walk through it. You could sort of, you saw the information data that produced the space, and then the actual construction, which was actually built by Venetian boat builders, which was very cool because they built it all without any glue or nails, which was a craft thing, but it was fascinating to watch that happen. But that's all you can do in Venice is it's hard to get a hammer. And then, so the idea then of the body and the virtual coming together, this again was a pre-matrix thing where we had two combatants produce a kind of spatiality between them, and then see what kind of artifacts result from that sort of dynamic and from those models. So then in the asymptote work around the same time, just before that actually, Lizanne and I produced a piece for the CCAC in San Francisco. We were Cap Street Residency, Cap Street Residency program in San Francisco. And this was a piece that is a one-to-one, fully built construction. And the idea was that it would contain, I mean, this stuff today looks kind of, benign. It's a little weird to see it after all, but at that time, there was nothing really like this. But it was a desire to be able to touch a surface, touch a three-dimensional object, and have it basically react to your skin and have its own skin. So the idea was that there were these virtual buttons, heat sensors, and there was actually a soundtrack that seems to not be playing. But each time you would go through a sequence that would do certain things, either distort it, turn it into a noise object, or turn it into some kind of a strange artifact or transformed morphological condition. And this was the noise sequence. I think the last one was we couldn't help ourselves, the hopelessly romantic rain sequence. Anyway, that was, but that was a very, very interesting piece to build and to test. Then in Venice, under Fuchsas, we were asked to produce a pavilion. And we decided to produce our own pavilion in the Giardini, on the other side of the Giardini, which was this strange pre-Kapoor object. And the idea was that this kind of red object would in fact, we worked with a technology partner called iPix, and they were the first people to produce, this is really going back, they were the first people to produce real-time web broadcast imagery. And it was pretty amazing. I mean, to sit in front of a computer in New York at the time and watch our pavilion like drying paint come down our screen slowly every 30 seconds, but in so-called real time, was absolutely fascinating. And so we used the technology to build the interior of this pavilion. And the idea was that in the pavilion were two of these IPIX cameras and these one-way mirrored oculi, if you will, these kind of lenses. And as you move through the space, your body, like the body that I just showed you, would actually push the objects aside, push these discs aside. As the discs pushed aside, it created this kind of distortion field. It distorted both the physical architecture and the virtual architecture, and those might be data by the camera I'm holding. And basically then, as you move around, it was a physical, let's say, correlation to what we were seeing already apparent in digital realms. The idea that you could affect space, that you could alter space, that you could somehow manipulate it and then re-image it and then broadcast it live over the web. At that live being every 30-second feed. So really then the digital and the body for us are kind of the let's say the sort of staples of or the kind of foundation of an architectural let's say journey in terms of our work. We produced this was actually in the art world. It was a multiple that was shown in New York in the gallery, and it was called the B-scape multiple. And basically what it was a putting together of body armor from sport into a single kind of fetishistic metamorphing object. I used to, when I used to lecture and actually lecture on this stuff a decade ago, I used to talk about this as a weird kind of analog to a protective skin in virtual reality. That there's a kind of a parallel here between the sports equipment, which somehow protects us and our envelopes, our body, our tissue against impact and against speed and movement. And this was a transition, and you'll see a lot of this in our work, this transition from this kind of analog reading of protection into a digital. From that, and around that time, I produced a lot of drawings, and this was really, what happened here was, having gone through the various things I've shown you, the Columbia studios were progressing nicely, and form kind of finding was getting very strong, and it was finding itself in both the industrial design world and the architecture world. And you were seeing, what we see today with Nike shoes, maybe you were seeing running shoes that were you could tell they were computer generated. You see objects, razors, cars, artifacts, and architecture was beginning to have this kind of, impact. So I frustratingly went to my studio and I said to Lizanne, I said, you know what, I'm not going to see you for about a week because I'm going to just draw. And I got this idea to draw, and I want to do this again, because I need to take some special drug, I think, to get in that state of mind again. But here I was, locked up and drawing these drawings, these eyescapes, and they were basically on a silicon, on a soft image 1.0 and then Photoshop, but they ended up as kind of collage pieces. And they were the mix now to go back to that early collage where I was bringing back analog work into the digital production that I was doing to produce these, what I called at the time, if I recall, these ambiguous territories between object and space, these kind of fetishistic, let's say, emblems of the period we were in, of the kind of metamorphing, transformative, liquid architecture. In fact, it may have been you. So I think it was you, now that I recall. I was with, I believe, Brian or someone, and the new cars were coming out, and I think Brian turned to me and said, the cars look bloated, right? There was this kind of thing that cars were beginning to look like they were retaining something. And I thought it was a very interesting kind of thing. And so into the work came this idea that the digital mapping and the wireframing would start to actually be able to manipulate, Cartesian space was gone now, and manipulating these kind of organic structures. So we took the eyescapes and we began to work with them in a very kind of, we moved them into this metamorphic model, and we produced this piece, which the CCA was one of the first to acquire, and it's in the MoMA collection, SF MoMA, and other places. You have it here. It's a little multiple that we put into a little, now anachronistic Sony box. But the idea was, in my mind at least, it was the first digital sketchbook that we were able to produce. The idea was that at this time I became very, very kind of fanatic about the fact that we're not going to be sketching anymore with pencil or with any kind of tools. We can sketch directly into the computer. We can produce computer artifacts that contain all the data we need that we get from a sketch, all the discovery we would traditionally get from a sketch, and we would be able to do that. So I produced this with a kind of vengeance. I had an incredible argument with Eric Moss and Tom Main in a symposium in Mexico where they got furious with me for saying that we won't be sketching anymore. They were nowhere near computers at the time. They thought I was had gone off the deep end. And I built this piece for that, as part of that lecture. Of course we sketch, and of course I still sketch. In fact, I think I sketch more today than Tom Main does, but the premise was to see, in fact, if the very origin of the notion of the sketch in an architect's hands could we manipulate technology, the technology to our service and do this kind of thing. And this has always been for me a fascination that the technologies are there for us to use as tools, not for us to become addicted to and therefore specialists in only one particular thing. We need to find a way to continually abuse these technologies into our service and into our need. That's the multiple you have. It was put into this kind of, again, a little bit boring from the art world, I guess, but put into this reflective box with different glass on each side. So it would produce, on one end, it would produce an infinite array of these things. It would sometimes be not seen through the glass as you move around it, and it plays on a continual loop. But for me, that's really, for me, personally, it's the first sort of digital sketchbook that we were able to produce. I'm thinking we may be doing another one in a different way now. But it really was a way to kind of, let's say, hold on to a moment in time when we knew something very, very powerful was taking place, but we didn't know exactly how to house it, how to control it, how to contain it, and how to exhibit it. We also built these larger pieces in the TZ Gallery in New York for Frederica Taylor, for her gallery, she had one. And this was the same data that you just saw. Unfortunately, I don't have any video footage of it. but running on flat screens, and they were state-of-the-art at the time. You can see by the outlines and so on, and then put into a much larger reflective two-way mirror box. And again, this desire to move this stuff off the screen into a full spatial envelope, into a full experiential condition, and that's what this installation was about. And then we got a commission, which was nice, doing all this experimental work. And this was from two curators at the Guggenheim Museum, John Anhart and Matthew Drutt, who got a Bowen Foundation grant and asked me and Lizanne to design a virtual Guggenheim Museum. And the idea behind the virtual Guggenheim Museum was really to produce a fully, not as you see virtual museums today, not like the virtual Google Museum or the virtual Hermitage or MoMA, or even that cheesy one that someone did, I don't know, whatever. The idea was to build a fully, for us at least, abstract spatial condition that you could enter and visit galleries and then house virtual artists as well as traditional, let's say, artists. So it was, at the time, John and Matthew had brought ideas of bringing Namjoon Pike into the galleries, one of the galleries, but also Mark Napier, I don't know if you know who that is, but an early digital artist, and a few others. And so it started with the sketches from the Icescape multiple you just saw. And here they were kind of laid out as a storyboard. These were the first storyboards we did. We said, okay, we can turn this one into a kind of atrium. It has some ghost of Frank Lloyd Wright in it, the kind of spirals, the ramps, so let's make that the atrium. We said the venues have the ghosts of, let's say, Frank Gehry and Bill Bao, and we could start to work with that kind of tectonic. And then Frank Rashid, I'm changing my first name just so I can stay with the Guggenheim legacy, into the galleries and produce another. So this was the idea, to morph between these three. So effectively what you had on that we produced, oops, let's see this for you. I'm sorry, back, forward. Okay. So this was an online scanner. You would actually pull this bar across the morphing model. As you moved across, it would tell you where you could visit. You could visit New York, Venice, Berlin, the virtual galleries, the media sphere. And as you toggled back and forth, you could then click on the entry ring, go into the museum proper, go into the plazas, go to Bilbao and so on, cyber theaters. And we really got quite far with this. We built a lot of these environments. It was a relatively low budget. I mean, the grant wasn't that big, but it allowed us to at least produce these interactive models and the sequences. And so here, this is actually a video of controlling the model. You had full control, and this was the time when 19.6 baud modem was the state of the art. So there was no such thing as broadband, but we anticipated broadband. So it's inevitable it will happen, but you can see the way it's designed was designed for slow internet feed as well as fast. So you could actually click on different moments and control the galleries in 3 dimensions. And the idea was to have full control over an architectural experience and then enter that experience and pick a gallery you want to go to and then fly into those galleries and use this sort of Kubrick-like fly-in sequence here, and then eventually you would find a gallery, click on it. This one happened, this was, I don't know which one, this is Namjoon Pike's gallery, I think. And the gallery would then unfold, and then you would experience the videos of Namjoon Pike on all the surfaces. Here was the entry sequence, past a Matthew Barney piece into a Jenny Holzer text spiral ramp condition. And it was, very much in thinking of sort of making the real experience of the Guggenheim into a delirious virtual one and holding on in a way to, and our idea always was this kind of McLuhan-esque idea that the old media would quote, so the new media would quote the old media. So that stayed with us as an idea of virtual reality. So here's the entry sequence again, I guess you saw that. And this just shows more of the moments. Okay. Then a real commission, bigger commission came into the office. This was, at the time that this commission came, I was teaching now, I'd moved my studios at Columbia from the kind of phenomenologically based stuff and the kind of effects of what we do with software and the sort of impact, to virtual reality. And I started working with VRML1 and VRML2 software platforms with the students. And we were producing in the studio at Columbia. One of the first things we did is we took films apart. I thought one of the interesting transitions to use virtual reality in architecture would be to do things that we always dreamed of doing in pre-computing, and that's really to dissect a film into its spatial conditions. And so I couldn't find the clip, but we did things like took Rope by Hitchcock, for example, and did a three-dimensional, let's say, move through the film, through Rope, and used the Rope sequence as a kind of time-based line through the sequencing of the film, and then took all the film components and moved them into a VRML model, virtual reality model. We did a couple of those. We did some Godard films. It's like I was a kid in a candy store, effectively, with this technology. So it was, all kinds of stuff that we were trying. So one day in the office, the phone rings, and this gentleman says, "Hi, I'm calling from the New York Stock Exchange, and I'd like to talk to you guys about doing a virtual reality environment for us." And I said, "You may have the wrong number." And he said, "No, I heard what you're doing at Columbia, and I'd like to come over and take a look at some of the work." And I remember turning to Lizanne and saying, "Okay, well, this guy's gonna last 16 seconds in here, and once he sees the virtual Rope Hitchcock, it's game over. So, we can dream about a big job, but it's not gonna happen." Anyway, this man, George Siegel, sat down, looked at the computer, watched that film, watched another piece we had done with walls that as you touch them, they would transform into liquid, and then you would hear liquid, and then you would transform the floors, things would happen in these kind of virtual reality realms. And so he commissioned us, and he commissioned us to do a stock exchange, or to build the New York Stock Exchange as a virtual space. So the wireframe, I'm just showing the wireframe here to start with this, it was the idea of just, and that's how primitive it is now to look at it, was really just to take the physical floor and remap it into a container, into a virtual reality container, populated with all the posts, more or less, as to where they are on the real floor. And then at the time I was addicted to, I used to have on my reading list for my students, believe it or not, a cartoon on Sunday mornings called Reboot. Reboot was based on these Vancouver animators who later became Pixar, I think, a lot of them. And it was fascinating. I mean, I remember at that time, I would actually wake up on a Sunday. I was younger, so I'd like to sleep in, but here I was, 7 in the morning, waiting for Reboot, we didn't have DVRs. And basically it was, beautifully texture mapped. It was just spaces that were incredibly beautiful. And this narrative was interesting, but the texture mapping, the computer technology was beautiful to watch. So that was really where it started to become kind of inspirational. So we said, well, can we make the stock exchange have walls that can be removed? Can we project data on every surface? Can we populate with posts that would emerge from the floor, be able to disappear when you want them, alert you to different things at times, and so and that's how it all really started to evolve. So the full model that they've been using now for for a long time, a decade or more, is this model. This is the video footage of it. It has removable walls. It has all these drawers that exist, and these are all the actual access to the servers that exist in New Jersey and Long Island City. They're far away from the actual exchange, and the circuit board connects, and they can actually accurately go to those places and see how their servers are doing, and so on. The circuit board runs in under the virtual floor. You can see Newt Gingrich there, so that'll tell you where that was. And the floor then came up with all the tickets and data. Now, the thing to remember when you look at this is that all of this was based on real-time information, and it was all pertinent information. None of this is fluff or aesthetics or sort of, I mean, of course, we employed certain aesthetic rules, but it had to be, it was for a client that was extremely stringent and critical that they get the data they need. It was almost militaristic in that way. So we invented, this were the interfaces we did for them, the full three-dimensional floor. We could tile and change the screens. We could bring up data boxes. You could look at certain kinds of containers. This was the Dow 30 container over here in the middle. You could go to posts themselves, see what's going on. We used nautical map iconography to show things like when a stock is down, when a stock alert is up. Each of these were the actual stocks trading on the floor. The stocks are up, the stocks are moderate. There's a trading imbalance on AOL. It's backwards there, I don't know why, and IBM. And then you could look at it from the top as a kind of heat map and monitor, what's going on at the actual post. And this would correlate to post number 2 on the floor, They could see there was we called it a heat thermometer, this yellow thing going up and down. You could bring HUD displays up and look at things like where AOL stock is, what its market conditions are, what's happening to the trades, and so on and so forth. And the whole thing was really, and still is, a monitoring tool, not unlike, navigating any kind of space outside of where you are. Here, they use this on the trading floor. They're constantly watching for aberrations in the market, strange things, potential insider trading, large volume trades according to news items or no news in a large volume trade is particularly worrisome to them, and so on. So this was the anatomy of the model, and it was extremely architectural for us, and it was really, and still is, I consider it to be a very, very, very important architectural commission. We built it, with a sub floor in which the stocks reside when they're not being alerted. We built all the virtual containers into the actual trading floor. The heat map is beneath it that comes up to the surface. All the posts, again, the news items, news feeds, the server domains, server environments, the gateways to all of their trades and so on. We learned a lot about the stock market doing this project. In fact, Lizanne was offered a job because we knew more about their business in some ways than they had even imagined we could, because we dug so deep into how this place operates. This was the underside, and you could, of course, because it's a virtual model, go underneath it, look at the circuit board, see the life. If it's red, there means there's an issue with the servers. They could fly back across those lines, those kind of Tron lines, back into the server, see what the problem is, monitor and fix things from here, and so on and so forth. I mean, one of the things that was, and I just told this story this morning, and I haven't actually ever told this story. It's the second time I'm telling it. But at Cranbrook, when I was a student with Daniel Libeskind as my teacher, when I first walked in the school, I decided my first project for the first 6 months of my 3 years there, I decided to do an analysis of Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights. And I became fixated obsessively fixated on the Garden of Earthly Delights to the point where I redrew it for 6 months straight by hand. Everything in excruciating detail, but not to re-render it as it was, but to reinterpret it as a kind of architectural landscape. They're very beautiful drawings. They're in a drawer somewhere. And I remember when we were doing this project, I got to the point where it was a little getting tedious, because the clients are extremely business-minded. The meetings were super business-oriented and super dry. And I remember going back to the studio and looking at this thing one night in delirium and thinking to myself, it's the Garden of Earthly Delights. That's what this project is. It's a kind of strange, it's purgatoria, it's heaven, it's limbo. It's these dances around these strange columns with these strange artifacts in them. There's a kind of a Dantean sort of dance going on here. And so that became a kind, and I'm just telling that story because I think, as architects, where I think we celebrate error, you could almost say, is in this kind of fascination with other aspects that are driving us to do what we're doing, not just the technical, not just the expertise. And that kind of infiltration of the other is really kind of interesting as to what it does to the work and how it changes it. And I remember that changed the project, because when we used to, Lizanne made me promise not to mention anything about Garden of Earthly Delights when I went to meetings at the stock exchange. The last thing they want to hear about is heaven and hell and this Dantean dance. But so I vowed not to say anything, although I did get caught using some esoteric language one day. But effectively, then it put us into a position where color theory, dynamics, action of moving through the space all became important things in my mind and in the way we architected this. So we actually worked very carefully to choreograph the fly-throughs, the actual timing of those passages to the stocks. The coloration became very important. In fact, we had a behavioral scientist show up a couple of meetings to discuss using what reds cause anger and what reds can be used to get away with in this model, which was amazing and fascinating for us. So we were in this kind of weird, almost medieval, painterly world of color theory, movement dynamics, reading of objects, and so on. These were the drawings we actually produced, just to answer your question earlier. We produced virtual drawings, which were like this. They showed the model in 3D. I hope we can find them all. And then they expanded to the anatomy of the object. This was one of the posts. It showed all the posts, the wireframe in there, showed all the technical data for the feeds, for the information feeds to be driven to these, because every billboard in there, every frame has to carry real-time data. So this was all the instructions to the computers to drive the data to these posts in 3D. This was what we call a grouping container, and this was actually when we nailed the project. We went to a number of presentations. There were some critics and cynics in the group, of course. I mean, they had much better things to do than sit and watch these two crazy architects present this stuff. But we showed them a simulation of the Hong Kong crash, which I believe was in the mid-'80s. It wasn't this model, but the Hong Kong crash model, we showed it to them like this. We then showed them that we could replay the data. If they contained all the data all day long, they would then have a library of data they'd go back and replay at any time. And they went crazy. That was it. The project was nailed shut. They wanted us to finish it. They signed checks, and off we went, because they realized that this wasn't just eye candy, that they could actually have a kind of contained, let's say, kind of physical model that was actually replayable at any time, stoppable, and then they could go back and look at it from a different angle and see what's going on. And for the business of the stock exchange, there's probably nothing more powerful or important to them than history and understanding of why things happened the way they did, when they did. In fact, on 9/11, when a lot of things stopped, this model, Dick Grasso, famously came on the news and said that he's going to reopen the stock exchange in 3 days, and everybody was completely shocked as how he could do that, if you recall that, or 2 days. Turned out that they had turned this model on. They went in and they actually used the model to check the servers, check all the technology, and the model is what told them that they could actually open up, and that's how they were able to open so quickly after the attacks in downtown. And there was a moment there where CNN came to us and wanted to use it as blue screen technology and have their commentators walk around in it, which would have been kind of funky and surreal. That didn't continue for whatever reason, but it became very real for a while. In fact, what didn't happen, this is why we're having trouble in terms of how we acquire all the stuff we produced, is that after 9/11, the stock exchange became extremely secure. I did all kinds of FBI checks and things after that. To get on the floor even, and the model is extremely coveted by them and very much contained. They had the Singapore exchange, the Hong Kong exchange wanted to buy the model or do things and do the same technologies. CNN wanted to use it on their broadcast, so everything kind of ground to a halt in terms of its proliferation after that. But it would have been interesting because the idea was that the commentators could walk around, touch surfaces, have the real-time data come up, look at the stocks, look at the information in real time, and move around this kind of landscape. Okay, so back to Earth, or somewhere. So the virtual reality, so we were learning along the way, right? We were learning about the body, about augmented spaces, about, see you, Reinhold, nice seeing you, about, the kind of importance of let's say, the impact of the virtual on the real and so on. And I set off on another exploration around this fascination with, as Suzanne says, every guy is fascinated with car bodies, but I became totally kind of interested in the styling and manipulation of the auto body as a result of computing and digital kinds of means, but also as containing a kind of story about speed, movement, vectors of transition, aerodynamics, forces, and so on. So I produced a whole series of these things I called M-scapes or motionscapes, and they were sort of, again, sketches. And this was the next generation of virtual sketching as far as I was concerned, both with texture mapping. This was the technology's changing now. We were able to actually put animated texture maps on, which we thought was fascinating. We were able to do a lot of stuff to much more intricate wireframes than we had ever done before. And so this was a sketchbook, let's say, for the M-scape series. So I produced a series of drawings these were the preliminary drawings that the models were based on. This was, I don't know what kind of cars they were. In the end, it didn't matter. They were refused together into another kind of object, into other kinds of, looking at things at that time, maybe naively, but at splines, at ridges, at ribs, at surface manipulation, and so on. And this object became sort of fascinating to us. It came back to a little bit the body armor thing. It was strangely sexual, but also strangely sort of protective, and had all kinds of weird, kept talking to us, let's say. And I had to work with it because I couldn't stand it any longer. I looked at this picture up on the wall. I was like, okay, we're going to keep on going with this one. And so we took this one and we decided, we got invited to Documenta in Kassel, Documenta 11. And at the time when we were invited to Documenta, that was kind of a shock to us. Oakley Elsinore came to us and invited us. And we said, well, what other architects are in your show? And he said, oh, maybe you haven't heard of them, Jonah Friedman and Constant. And I went, jaw on the floor. I said, they're in the show? And he goes, yeah, we're producing work. I said, we're actually in. And so we took the M-scape piece and we manipulated it as a three-dimensional model and started to data map onto it cities. The idea was to do in a kind of dialogue with Constant and Friedman, was to do a kind of digital urban project, right? And so what happened was we were able to, spoiler alert. Okay. So we were able to, hello? Oh, okay. So what you're seeing here is the idea of rolling the auto body artifact over these cityscapes. We took Hong Kong, we took Tokyo and New York, and peel those texture maps up into the object. And the idea was to install them in Kassel as a kind of experiential space that would then play the artifacts as if they were the cities. Okay, that sounds a bit strange. So we set out to have people recorded in elevators because that's the only place we could find quiet enough. We had people recorded in Tokyo and Hong Kong and New York, and the idea was just to record conversations in those cities, and then tie those conversations to the skyscraper. Let's say like a player piano, to the kind of data notation. So that one you just saw go by was New York, this is Hong Kong. And you can see that the texture maps, just by virtue of the artifactual evidence of those cities, is already very different. They have very different textures, and even though we look at the city skylines and say, oh, they're very similar, there is a kind of the idea was to seek out what I hypothetically, problematically call the kind of DNA of these places. And so this became a kind of DNA receptor or reader. And so each city was subjected to this kind of painterly sort of wallpapering of this artifact, this strange artifact, and then it was brought to the space in Kassel. So that was as we installed it, we installed it so that there's a strange shot of it because this is from the actual mirrors that were driving the data feeds up to the model. But when we installed it, we borrowed a page from Adolf Loos, and the page was the American bar, and the mirror sort of condition at the top of the American bar, which creates a kind of infinite ceiling in Vienna. And so we produced, this was, the laser mirror, oh, look at that. So this was about 6'10" or 7 feet to this point here. So as you walked in, you basically were below this threshold of mirror. Then we used mirror around the entire room, built 2 of these large objects about 30% longer than this room, and hung them in space and video projected with templates. You can see the templates there. The data back onto the surfaces very accurately, so there was no spray, no sort of light moving anywhere, and that would create this kind of this strange sense that the object is spinning in the space. In fact, when we opened the show, 2 artists, but I guess artists are the way they are, they walked in the space and went, how did you take over all of Kassel? And we said, no, it's one room, because when you stood in there, it looked like this thing was running infinitely in every direction. And I thought, I want to be an artist. I want to be able to think things like that. So this is the actual work. making a sound out loud? So what you're seeing now is the default condition. Now the kind of Cagean music starts to play. And the cool thing was about the sounds in the space was that they really did capture in a strange way the temperament of these cities. You know, Tokyo sounded like chirping birds for whatever reason. And it was totally accidental or chance. Hong Kong sounded, that was Hong Kong, I think that last one, I don't know what that sounded. And New York really sounded kind of paranoid and strangely sort of obsessive. But it was very nice that the kind of correlation between the kind of visual, standing in the space, seeing this underbelly of the city, that's a sonic reference as well as a digital reference, and then kind of making the reference of the reading. We're catching up in time now. This is a few years ago at 2006, I believe, Biennale. Under Aaron Betsky's Biennale, we were invited to produce an installation in the Arsenale. And what's happened to the work is, I think, we decided to produce a piece in Venice, and this is kind of the tail end of this whole story in some ways, which had no computing, no digital, let's say, no digital imaging whatsoever. What we wanted to do is we set out to produce what I called a kind of architectural wind tunnel, and that I would be able to put these objects into an ether of light, and that light would then transform the objects in terms of their morphology and their kind of form and their presence, and then use these kind of mirrors like we use on the iScape model to produce this kind of place of sort of, let's say, liquid architecture, but real. Everything was real and built. So these artifacts were built in Long Island and shipped over to Venice and installed on this light table. And again, I don't have footage of this. I think there's some video somewhere, but that as the light hues change, a little bit like the same technology that James Turrell is using right now in the Guggenheim installation that he just did. The light shifts very, very slowly, modulates, and as it does that, it changes these objects almost physically. They seem to melt, they seem to float, they seem to produce different kinds of presences and realities. The only person who really liked this project was Ai Weiwei. I don't know, a lot of the architects just walked past me and said, whatever, but Ai Weiwei stopped and stood a long time and talked to him. I just met him at that Biennale, and I was, so that says something about him. But then these were the pieces that would then create this kind of optical interference situations between. So you can see here the kind of, the desire for us to again extract from computing, extract from the digital something that we could put into the world that actually is physically there, is actually touchable, is physically occurring in real time and in a present situation. So what happened, interestingly enough, was the piece in the middle. I got a call from the Guggenheim Museum, and the Guggenheim asked me to put a piece on auction in their annual fundraiser. And I said, again, like when your stock exchange called, I said, I think you have the wrong number. And they said, no, we want you in the auction. And it was Nancy Spector. I said, well, who else is in the auction? And just so I know my company, oh, you know, Richard Prince, Anish Kapoor, Cindy Sherman. I said, you know, I'm not going in this auction. It'll be the most embarrassing night of my life to have a piece go up on auction after those guys. And then, you know. Well, it turned out that they were very serious. So we produced a house around one of these pieces. We started thinking of it as a kind of home, and we thought we'd auction a house as a kind of more as an art piece. The idea wasn't to build this. It was just to reframe it as a completely different object, a digitally produced artifact, goes back to those auto body studies, place it on a landscape. The landscape was arbitrary, it didn't matter, it just looked nice and white on snow. And I'm at the auction, and it sold for $35,000. And I was completely floored that someone would buy a drawing and a little model for that much, by someone relatively unknown, I thought. And it turns out, he comes up to me, the gentleman, after and says, I'll come and visit your office tomorrow because you owe me a house now. And I said, no, you just bought the drawing. It doesn't exist. He goes, we'll see you in the morning. So the next morning, in comes this very nice guy and his wife, and they sit at the boardroom table, and I'm trying to tell them now that they didn't actually buy a house, they bought a drawing and a model. And his wife says, Maria says, you know, we know that, we're just pulling it. We'd like to build this house. And I said, you really? who are you? And it turns out, so, well, we own a nice little villa in Finland called Villa Maria. And I go, wow. And they said, we'd like to build this next door. And I went, there's land next door? I was like, in shock. Anyway, turns out we've been working on this now for a couple of years with Carl Gustav and his wife. And they have a number of things there in Finland. But they fell in love with this because what happened was they realized that they were intrigued by it. We started to get more intrigued by it. We realized that we were producing we had moved the digital sort of fascination, the auto body fascination, the body fascination, you saw that morphing body earlier, into an actual place that you could inhabit as a home. And we became very serious about it as well. We thought about it in terms of the changing landscape, of snow versus dry seasons, the different sort of sighting possibilities, and the fact that we could probably build it with some state-of-the-art technologies. So we actually went down to Ancona in Italy and met with the Wally boat people and discussed with them building this in carbon fiber, or at least the underbelly in carbon fiber. And they've done, crazy Russian yachts in carbon fiber. And so we thought this is quite doable. So the idea was, and this is very early in the studies, but the idea was to build the carriage of the house in a like a bridge, like a double bridge, in a carbon fiber underbelly, and then build the floors inside. And because it's Finland, because of their history, and also with Artec and so on, it would be a wood interior, bent wood interior into a carbon fiber casing. So very much like a kind of yacht. And this was the early studies. And the one thing that I told them, and we stuck to, and we're still sticking to, is that there are no windows in the house. There's no actual, and there is something here to do with the virtual and the digital, because the idea of doing a house that has no actual operable windows, but celebrates light and atmosphere by virtue of apertures. So the ends of the house are glazed to the snow or to the sky. And then the cylinders running between them are the only place where light and nature would come into. So it would snow through the middle. All the light would come in through these central cores. And people, the bedrooms for Carl and his wife are on one side, the children's rooms on the other, the library, his art collection, a dining hall in the center of the house, and then a kind of recreational area at the top for the kids, and then the proverbial hot tub finish. That crazy thing they do. And so these were the early plans. And as we worked on it, I thought, it's actually a very traditional house. It felt very kind of like the Ville Savoie, or something about it just seemed normal. The cars park in the porte cochere, you come in on the other side, you go up. It's totally normal. You go into these spaces, the spaces are lit here by these skylights that light these rooms. The rooms then circle up to the various rooms. Here's the dining room, here's the library. Library is here. Children's rooms, playroom, living room, and so on. And that's ongoing. And then also in terms of building, this is now moving to building design. We, in 2002 actually, built our first building. So at the same time we were doing the virtual exchange in the late 90s, the virtual Guggenheim, the paperless studios all in the late 90s, early 2000s. We started designing this building in Holland. We won this in a competition, and it's called the Hydra Pier. And the idea was to build a pavilion for the Floriade, for the flower festival, on a polder in Haarlemmermeer. And so we designed it originally as a temporary structure, but they fell in love with it and they decided they wanted it as a permanent structure. And because we were moving into this world of virtual real assimilation, we decided that the building should be covered in water as a kind of texture map that would run into pools, and then you would enter the building through the water surfaces as they come down and produce a kind of threshold condition. So you come off the land under a pool of water, and this pool of water would have a 5-meter datum where the water was, as Holland retrieved land from the 5-meter datum as a kind of commemorative thing. Come through under this roof structure into the pavilion proper, and the water would actually produce texture maps and surfaces that would reflect down below into the pavilion. This was built, and ended up in Time magazine, which was a shock to us as a double-page spread. And it was very nice because, in a way, there were two things that happened in terms of the computing transitioning into building. This is an anecdote, one of the things that happened was after working on this in those virtual models and creating all kinds of, and looking at it, studying it, designing it, I showed up on site and it was about 30% along, or the steel was going up and so on. And it was, you could see now the building, and I was kind of shocked because when you build your first building, to actually see it go from the computer into reality is shocking and kind of amazing, and it's an interesting moment. But then I got totally taken aback because I called Lisa back in New York and I said, I'm standing here in front of our building, it looks just like the computer drawing, it's beautiful, but there's a guy with no shirt on hammering a bolt. And she goes, well, what's wrong with that? I said, it's so medieval. I mean, this thing should this thing should have just been stereo printed out of the polder. Well, why would somebody need to put a bolt in it? And it was that distortion, that weird thing to realize that architecture is this kind of weird double game. We design these things, they seem, we'd like them to be built by robots or robotically like a car is. We'd like it to be precise and precision, but at the end of the day, somebody has to screw something into the wall or push something aside that doesn't quite fit. And there's a Howard Rourke kind of moment in the process. And so it was interesting to see that, and it became a kind of interesting moment. But what was nice about the building and in completion was the fact that it kind of held up, at least in my mind, to some of the theoretical premises, which was that the building looks like it's literally 3D printed. And this is before 3D printers came into being or even were on the horizon. And it looks like it emerges from the polder. The way it's lit, the way it exists is in a kind of semi-real sort of state. It's also on the flight path of the 380A that lands at Schiphol, and it sits in this kind of weird Dutch landscape. So it kind of pulled together a number of things: a technological artifact, celebrating flight, celebrating the pumping stations that drove the water off the land to be able to use the land, the power of water as a kind of force, as a natural order, the transitional moment of coming past water, the sonic aspects, like a sonic texture map in a computer that would actually play, but it's real water. And I know that because when I took the Queen of Holland through here, it splashed on her, and they got very upset. and the wind was going the wrong way. And then you came in, and then underneath you had this, and then the kind of strangely contained pavilion in the center with its proverbial Dutch orange there under there. And then this weird kind of moment between what I saw at the time as a 21st century object being built with no mullions. This is all cold pressed glass that's held in place. If you're interested in technology, but this wasn't curved glass. We had to pin it back. It's still there. All these years later, it hasn't sprung away. And it sits in a triptych of a Dutch landscape, like a Dutch landscape painting, which is false, right? So you have a fake landscape that the Dutch planted, which then romanticized through Dutch painting. You have the triptych windows at the back of this thing that looks somewhere between a Saarland's air terminal and some strange dirigible and something else. And then I've seen pictures on the internet which fascinate me, the way people kind of mediate the object. And so this is someone's image that we found in Flickr or something, and it's just I love this image. Lynn hates it. I don't know what that says about us, but I think that there's something about this image which just talks about its strange kind of I tell you, around the time I was designing this, there was also the David Lynch's Dune, I think, was around, and there was that great scene in Dune where God is in a streetcar. He was an embryo as a whale. And there's something about that kind of mobile whale embryo streetcar thing that stays with me when I look at this picture. Moving on, in Abu Dhabi, we've done a couple of big projects. And this one I just thought I'd show because as the studio has been maturing and doing larger works and bigger projects, we've maintained we've maintained all of our interests and everything I've talked about, but we've also adopting, of course, very solid interests in BIM modeling, parametric modeling, and altering computer models according to the desires of both our clients and our needs as architects, and what we're trying to produce. So these were the first sketches so this is like the third sketchbook I'm showing today for the for the Strata Tower that we designed in Abu Dhabi. And this was the end result of that process and the building itself. And the building, actually 3.5 stories of it exist until the Lehman crash came. So if you look on Google Earth, you can see the foundation. It's beautiful, with sand on it. It's like when Napoleon found the pyramids, you know. But we did manage to get it out of the ground, at least, and the idea was that it would be this. It was a kind of counterattack, let's say, to the Burj in Dubai, as a sort of sail, as an iconic sort of symbolic building. This building is celebrating the attire of the region, the Bedouin tents, the sort of the temperature, the heat, the dunes, the water. It's a kind of a set of objects, a set of things that came into play to produce this kind of shroud or this kind of veil over the building. And the helipad. You don't want to know about the helipad. It's a very interesting story, but I won't tell it. And then the idea was that the entire facade is in fact constructed in these louvers. And these louvers are all attenuated to computer technologies that allow them to open and close according to the sun angle on the building facade itself. So the idea was that the entire skin is a responsive skin to the extreme heat, of course, and sun, and that the apartments are all behind these are double-story penthouse apartments. There's swimming pools on each floor, and this, yes, one ask. And this is not the 99% project, this is the 0.01% project. Yeah, the swimming pools and decks here, and everybody lives behind these louver systems, and in fact, as the sun comes down and moves across these surfaces, alters the skin of the building. So it's a living, the idea was to produce a living skin on this tower that you actually could see changing according to the light through the day. And the cap itself was an interesting study. This took me back a bit to the virtual Guggenheim, because, formally at least, because we weren't allowed to build past this height. We weren't allowed to have cranes beyond this height. So we had to design a single piece that could be helicoptered by 2 military copters and dropped on the building as a capping of the building, which I thought was, I couldn't wait for that moment. It was like film crews, and it's going to be amazing. So here you see, just 2 images of the project under different lighting conditions, and the kind of enigma of the surfaces according to the play on these surfaces and on this torqued object. And I think I haven't built. I mean, you guys are the doctors in here. That I haven't built the actual connection, but I think it was very close in terms of trying to understand something of how phenomena, light and optics can play on a large 50-story, 60-story building. And then another project, quickly, this was the first sketch for the Yas Marina Hotel in Abu Dhabi. And this was a project that we won in a very quick competition. Basically, we had a very short time span to build, it's like Fitzcarraldo. We had 18 months, I think, or 22 months to build basically an icon for Abu Dhabi that would open with the Formula One race and would be sort of situate the city and the place in terms of its architecture. So as a result of that, we had an idea to build relatively straightforward hotel buildings, 2 of them at 500 rooms, crossing a racetrack, half the hotel in the water, half the hotel on the land, and then produce a liquid skin over that, a skin that would react to light, would react to data, would be a kind of a coming of age for us from back in the days of the exchange and the virtual Guggenheim. So the first models were really these are the very early model that we did, actually one of the first ones. It shows the skin as a kind of a jeweled sort of condition, draping the hotel buildings and producing this kind of this sort of object. And the object, in a way, was meant again to sort of deal with the yachts, deal with the automobiles, deal with speed, deal with trajectory, and become a kind of fluid, mutating object over the landscape. So in 2009, this was basically super quick. We started the project, I think, about a year earlier, a year and a half, 12 months earlier. And this was the construction of the building that was beginning to emerge, and it was fascinating to see it kind of come to life. The idea was that this entire skin would be brought down on 7 points across the track. And we had to finish this building, the bridge and the track, 3 months prior to the testing of cars on the track. So it was all super fast and happened simultaneously with the hotel rooms being finished, the skin being finished, and so on. So today, it worked. It opened on time. It's been refurbished already once because we did it so quickly in the beginning. And basically, you have this kind of draped, amorphic surface of 5,680 different diamond shapes that trace their way over the whole building. But despite the fact what people would think with budgets in that region, it was tight. And what we ended up doing was parametrically optimizing that entire facade down to 100, if you're interested in the Senate stuff, 112 different panels. So it became reasonable to build. And that was all done by virtue of the geometry shifts between the larger diamond and the smaller diamond. And that came as a result of a desire that I had, a perverse desire, which was that every panel on this building would essentially shift on a servo motor according to the cars going under the building. So as every car went under the building, that the entire skin would shimmer like a shiver, like your skin shivers. And it actually stuck. I was amazed. I went to meetings in Vienna, and Abu Dhabi, and in Stuttgart, and everybody's going forward with this thing. And I'm thinking no one's realized that it's going to be insanely expensive. But so we actually, if you see the building, there's actually nodes. Each of these is a node that can contain a servo motor. The 11th hour they were pulled, of course. It's insanely expensive. But what it allowed us to do was it allowed us to decide on the angles of all the glass to optimize the sense of movement across the surface, and also not to blind the drivers, believe it or not, as they come down the straightaways. We had to shift all the angles away. It also produced, if you're interested, an environmental response, because this became a skin like animals have, which actually ventilates naturally by virtue of hot air running through the surface. So there's a constant breeze on the roof of this building, even when there's no wind, which is kind of amazing. And that's because the air is being tracked up through these fissures up over the top on both sides. And there you see the bridge, drapes thing. These are the hotel rooms. This all sits proud of the hotel rooms, and basically. And then you have this data feeds. What essentially happens is that every one of these nodes has a video projector in it. So there are 5,680 video projectors, and they project onto a fritted piece of glass. And the fritted piece of glass picks up the information, and you can run any data feed you want over the surface. But the idea was that it wouldn't be Coca-Cola ads or, celebrate King so-and-so, whatever. That the idea was that it would be a kind of continually changing and metamorphing surface, more of an atmospheric work. And in fact, at one point we simulated the building moving at 260 miles an hour, did the video feed and put it on top of it and looked at it while we were there in the desert, and it was pretty cool to see the building spinning through the desert, but we didn't stick with that when they wanted to. And then, it does this kind of Dan Flavin thing with light. It changes the light that's outside. Planes turn violent green when they go by. And this is from one of the hotel rooms looking back towards it, and it's constantly changing and constantly altering its kind of luminous condition depending on the video feeds we send in. So this is actually my favorite picture of the building, because I think, in a way, and it's the last slide, I think in a way it talks a little bit about the whole, I'm mid-career, I hope. So it's the kind of, point where a lot of what I showed you has come to a sort of fruition in a physical building. But the building is dematerializing, and I love these kind of, if you watch the Formula One, sort of broadcast, the building is a kind of atmospheric backdrop that is constantly there performing, but performing in a kind of constantly mutating and transforming state. So it is a kind of liquid architecture made manifest. Okay, sleep on it, and I'll answer all your questions tomorrow.
I'm wondering, especially on the last project, because the transition is very obvious that you're very interested, or you're being pushed to be very interested into the data and information.
Into what else?
into data.
Data.
And information, asking this question for you, and how this gets translated into environments and architecture and into an atmospheric model. So I'm wondering, behind the data, behind the management of data, there's a kind of compromise with what the environment should be, what the city should be, or just a political agenda, an idea of public space in the case of this last building, or this is kind of, this an agenda that you're going.
Yeah, you know, that's a good, great question. I can see that tomorrow's going to be a lot of fun. But I think that first of all, I'm not so interested in data per se. I think I'm interested in well, maybe that's what you mean. I'm interested in what data, if you can call it data, how it mutates spatiality, or how it transforms the spatiality in which we exist. I mean, I have a, let's say a kind of, I can almost call it a kind of pedestrian or sort of reading of spatiality in the sense that, what's not so much, but the space we exist in today is dramatically different than that of our fathers, grandfathers, grandmothers, so on, once you go back in time. And the reason it's, and my question always, at least in the work we're doing and in our kind of reaction is, what's making it different, right? This room is the same room, well, I know this was done in the 80s, I guess, but let's say we're in a kind of, in an older building, and you would be in a space where it's the same space it was prior, but our reading of that space is dramatically different, by virtue of many things. Data is part of that, I think social networking now and sort of virtual reality and the fact that the blurring of those things and there's things coming down the pipe that will continue to change and alter the way in which we read space physically. I think also numerically is about political space, right? About the space of the polis systems in which we exist together, and that's under a state of flux. I have to say, and this sounds like an apology, but I think in many ways I came to the decision some time ago that as architects, and this is a bad thing to say. I would take the task on this, I'm sure, but in some ways we sometimes have to have, within reason, within limits, we have to have a kind of surgical approach to our patients right in front of us, right? We have to sort of work with what it is we're working with. Now, if you don't agree with the politics of that patient, right, you could kill them on the table. But I think you move into an objective kind of situation in terms of dealing with the project, dealing with the issue at hand. If there's something come out of it that in fact betters the situation, then I think that's really terrific. In the case of this project in Abu Dhabi, I have to say it was dubious a little bit on a number of levels in terms of our going into it. We were a bit nervous about the kind of rampant expenditures we saw. I mean, the island we were working on was a $30 billion project, the whole project. Politics we weren't actually in agreement with necessarily, other things. But what we realized was that maybe the thing where we enter as architects, and maybe this is tied to data, I'm not sure, is that maybe we can produce something that actually gives a sense of pride in place that's different than the kinds of things that are being built in the region that normally speak of pride of place, or of which are sort of cheapened historical kind of reenactments, Disneyland aesthetics, glitter for the sake of glitter, the Dubai skyline, for example. Now, I know this project is somewhat, I wouldn't say it's ostentatious, but it's somewhat elaborate, but the trick was that somehow in this geometry, we thought we were finding a kind of an elegant sort of historic form, let's say the arabesque, the mathematics of the algorithm producing a kind of beautiful sort of shell. The interiors, which we didn't show, are all very kind of abstract. And the idea was that maybe there's a way to sort of lift the notion that that people see this project in that region as something to be very proud of for different reasons than they're normally, than just the trophies that they're normally this kind of. I don't know if we succeeded, and I don't know where I'm going with this, but the point is that it starts out very much a kind of, you have the project, you start to work with it, and then you hope that somehow in there you might be able to discover and decipher something powerful and compelling that can lead to a sort of, let's say, a kind of improvement. Now, that can run the gamut. It could be environmental, It can be, social, it can be political, it can be, there's a number of things there. But I guess what I'm saying is that pure research, in my mind, is what it's about. Finding a way to do the work very purely. But as I said, that's a naive answer.
A purely formal question. I was really struck, and I like very much that he made at the end, because part of your work is pointing, it seems, toward the atmospheric, as you say, the cloud, the scintillation, etc. And another part is pointing toward the kind of enigmatic, almost stone-like closed, of form closing itself.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, what kind of relation, what articulates these two aspects? We've seen, for example, in the case of the urban landscape,
Right.
there is something having to do with movement.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? It seems to me there are really this category of the static, very sculptural, and then the cloud, atmospheric, etc. So how do they are, because here clearly it's the movement, or the distortion of the movement. How do you think of that contrast in more general terms?
Yeah, no, that's a very important question and very interesting. I mean, we just built another building just recently in Daegu in South Korea, which literally is what you just described. It's like a stone that's being captured in this sort of skipping state on the landscape and the mountainscape. It's quite beautiful, but it's very solid. And I have been having a lot of trouble publishing it or coming to grips with it because it seems so stable. It's like it's there, and it's very object driven. And inside, we just managed to get some video feed of inside, which is actually James Terrell was going to install the interior, which is it's a liquid interior. It's all moving and completely dismantled, let's say. But I think in terms of I don't know how to answer that question really. I mean, I think that the work always is struggling to find its liquid presence, its dismantling, its dissolution.
Change of phase.
Yeah, or kind of confronting confronting the stasis of an object, and maybe that's a confrontation of architects before me historically. Because even in as much as I admire, and Lisanne was educated by Frank, and she's a Frank Gehry student at Yale. But I think that as much as I admire the work, I still find it remarkably static. And I think that there's some kind of desire here to find it mutate and move and leave its stasis somehow, even though it's one of the more dynamic architects, right? But I think there's something in that, and so we've gone to. I guess it has to do with material choices. It has to do with the way even the obsession with rotating each panel in this building at the end to produce different glints and different conditions. To the client side, it's a little bit weird. I mean, they were looking and going, "Are you sure every panel has to move like 0.6 degrees across the entire surface?" I think, yeah. And they were just rolling their eyes. In fact, one of the reasons we got that building built was they had no choice but to do everything we told them to do because there was no way out. They had to get it constructed for the race. So we sort of took advantage and started doing things like that, which would have been VE'd out. All of that stuff would have been cut probably. Even the whole shroud would have been probably taken away had there been time to.
Well, that's what Rem said about your money.
What's that? Sorry.
That's what Rem said about your money.
Yeah.
They had to get it done for training, so you kept on adding complicated, which otherwise never got through.
Right. No, it's true. And in fact, we weren't necessarily adding. I don't think Rem was either. We weren't adding complications to complicate the matter. We were realizing that we were doing what we did normally, but nobody was questioning us. And normally there would be questions. Normally somebody would sit in a meeting and say, "Excuse me, is there another way to do this?" In fact, it happened. There was a meeting with Wagner Bureau in Vienna with this project. Who built it, and it was a pivotal. It was an important meeting. We had everybody there. We had Schley-Bergerman was our engineer from Stuttgart. We had Wagner Bureau. We had Front Technologies. We had Gehry Technologies, who did the parametric modeling for us. We had a whole group of experts. It was this Apollo 13 moment, right? We're all like, have to make the air conditioning work on the section. And the client's sitting next to me, and he looks at me, and it was just like, it was a moment of horror. He turns to me and goes, just make it 2 domes. He goes, can you? And I look, I go, pardon me? He goes, just 2 domes, okay? Or else we're never building this. And I'm like, I went into shock. Because we had done all this work and all these experts and everything. And it was at that moment that, and it was literally this like Apollo 13 moment. It was that moment when Schley, Dairy Tech, my guys who were doing all the modeling design work, Wagner Bureau, they went in another room with the computer model, optimized the model quickly, did a spreadsheet right there and then of the cost basis versus a dome. Put it up on the wall and showed, compare the dome to what we were doing. And that's how we got through. And the guy says, is this real? And he had all these experts in the room. Of course, everyone's going, yep, that's it, that's real, that's how much you're going to spend. And it was all because of the rapidity and ability to computer model this stuff. Yes?
In the last 2 projects that you showed, the first one you referred this stereotype of the desert and the dunes
I saw him turn around to you when I said something problematic. Oh boy, they're not going to like that. That's okay. It's okay.
Well, in that project,
and I was
to Arabesque geometries and much more.
You're talking about the tower.
No, the first was the tower, and the last one, the hotel that you showed, referred to the kind of the Arabesque geometry as a kind of a reference. These 2 references seem to be totally different. So which one of them is
totally different for each project or within the project?
As a set of
so the mathematics of the arabesque versus the organic
mythology, the dunes and this kind of reference to the desert. And in some of these 2.
Do you know what really messed me up in my life, my career? My dad was an abstract expressionist painter, right? He studied in Paris in the 50s. And I grew up around abstract painting, okay? So every time I walk up to my father, from the time I was 2, I say, Dad, what is that painting of? He would start going on about some strange stories, and I couldn't see anything he was describing, right? It was like, always complete abstraction. But I think that, in a strange way, that's why I also showed collages at the beginning, something came into my state of mind and way of working that allows me in some strange way to overlap somewhat disparate, if not incongruous kind of reasoning. So there is an element of abstraction at work in the work, which I kind of celebrate. I mean, when we have meetings on these projects and I see things in the work that speaks to this kind of moment of, it's the sewing machine umbrella dissecting table, right, in the surrealist kind of moment. When I see things that actually spark off each other and produce a kind of unexpected, reaction or occurrence, I celebrate those things in the office. Much to the chagrin and dismay of my project architects who sit there looking at me like, oh God, not again. We had it, we knew what we were doing, now we gotta go, we gotta change things. And I think that, yes, and it's probably, you're absolutely right. The geometries of a Bedouin tent, let's say, and these kind of flowing garments and protectors of heat and light and the way they move, and is very different to the strict geometries of the arabesque and both traditions kind of hovering there, which I found interesting, right? That you have, you have on the one hand this kind of, that's part of actually what makes the place surreal, right? If you're in that part of the world, these 2 things overlap strangely sometimes. But I think that in a way I kind of got excited about the fact that we could produce a billowing structure that almost looks like a kind of like an oasis, not an oasis, like a mirage, right, on the desert, like a liquid mirage. But at the same time, it's strictly kind of contained in its mathematical purity. And so when you see these vaulted conditions, they're remarkably, they're very powerful. It's very powerful to be in that vaulted space. And that thing is, from an engineering point of view also, it's fascinating how far we were able to span and then carry this building diameter in very few points and so on. So it's those moments, that's why I'm saying, I was sort of jokingly saying I'm kind of mid-career, is like these, I'm learning all the time as we do this stuff, but to sit there in a meeting with engineers who get excited about the fact that we can pull everything down to 7 points in space and drape this thing like a fabric is, music to my ears. Right? It's like, okay, that's what we're looking for. Right? And then when we go into the color mapping and produce different kinds of qualities of surface, you can sort of see in this film, I guess. I mean, to me, this was, this is the eyescapes. It's just the flickering and the shimmering and the kind of, these video feeds that we constructed in New York and sent over by the internet. We can control all the data on this coming from New York, so we basically are sending them video feeds all the time. And they're all basically, I don't have my own film, right? I have Abu Dhabi tourism, so it's pathetic, but but that's also a kind of fascinating. But I think from I think the one thing that is, when I teach my students in Vienna, to work, the thing that I find the most important thing to impart on them in terms of design is a kind of unabated curiosity and desire to explore. And if I can get that, I think that's what I'm also driven to in the work, is that if it allows me to continue to explore something. So there is a kind of thread going through here, but at the same time, it's also, there's a lot of impatience because I get bored quickly and want to move on to something else, which is what, part of the problem. Also the virtue, maybe. There's an interesting story about this. This is completely off this has nothing to do with anything. It's just a story that I love, is that my mother called, my mom. She calls me from Abu Dhabi. She goes to this building. It has this building has the party, it's supposedly the hottest party spot in Abu Dhabi. I don't know what that's about, but the roof of it is very active, okay? My mother goes there, typical mom. She's up on the roof, she calls me and she said, Hani, I'm going to the doctor tomorrow morning. My eyes are definitely gone now. I said, Mom, you always have a problem. What are you talking about this time with the eyes? I mean, your eyes are fine. She's like, no, I'm standing in your building. It's very nice, by the way. But all the planes flying over are lime green. So something's wrong with my eyes and I have to get an operation. And I said, Mom, it's okay, that's normal, because, and I tried to explain that the colors shift according to, because when the facade is this color, anything beyond is violent green, and she was convinced that she, her eyes. Anyway, but there's those kind of, it's all, I mean, you'll notice also in the way I talk and the way I describe the work, there's a lot of references. I mean, my references tend to be coming from the art world. They tend to be coming from the world that I was spawned in with my dad, and where I basically, spend my time researching. So if I can do what Mr. Turrell can do and bring it to the architecture, I'm very happy. If I can bring what Mr. Flavin did, and in this case, and others, it's inspiring work. Yeah. Ladies first.
Really? Okay, I'm going to Louise first. Ladies first. Actually, I'd like to riff on what you last said about James Turrell and Flavin, and kind of also connecting that to the virtual reality of your work early on, especially in contrast with later work. There's a kind of sort of magic that happens, especially when you see the Kapurian Pavilion, where you actually bring the virtual reality into the real.
Yeah.
And it kind of reminds me of like Paul Anderson talking about mixed reality, which is an article I sent it to you. It's really good. And I'm wondering if you want to get more into that, where you do have these things sort of disappearing and all you see is like this virtual in the real. Because here it's almost like you can see it as an application, whereas with James Turrell, when you go in, it's almost like primitive.
Yeah.
Or with McCall, right, you actually bring that space is virtual into the real.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm quite good friends with Olafur Eliasson. Last time I saw Olafur in Venice 2 weeks ago, I said, there's this constant debate we have, which is he just thinks I get lots of nice big budgets to work with, and he wants them too. But I think he's got incredible freedom, and I think and he ends up getting bigger budgets than us now. But the thing is that in my mind, Terrell, Elias, and many of these artists who are working within the borders of architecture are the places where the pure research is taking place. That's the way I read it. These are, when I went to the Guggenheim yesterday, actually, finally, just to go take a look, I'm walking into a lab. To me, it's it's teeming with people. They're all gawking into the sky. But I'm there to see what the purest experimentalist is able to do with a very rarefied moment within this equation, right? Without any contamination whatsoever. Because the amount of contamination we suffer as architects is insane. I mean, it's from value engineering to it's very complex and it's very hard. I'm proud of this building because I know. I mean, you can like it or not like it, but I know what we were up against in terms of everything from timelines to budgets to experts, to the point where the sheikhs had a bet with each other that we weren't going to get it done. and what was on the table for my clients, as an aside, was a giant tract of land was going to be taken away from him and given to another sheikh, right? And I'm told this 10 days before we open the building, and I'm looking at going, guys, I'm not interested. You do what you need to do. We're going to get this thing done. But having said that, I think it's problematic when architects apologize that they can't get to the things that you're talking about. But it is the desire to get there. There is a kind of a desire that there is a kind of, let's say, a folding in of the virtual into the real to produce another kind of, let's say, a spatial situation. But it's I think it's a very difficult thing to achieve in full-fledged building design. But we're getting there. We're on that trajectory. That's what our work is about.
Thanks for the lecture. I found it very interesting when you said that somehow you think that Frank Gehry's work is static.
I know, ruffles and feathers.
I definitely think that your work has a dynamic quality. But I would like to go back to both the project of the house for Finland and the project of the tower. And I would like to know what's your take on this dynamic quality from the point of view of organization, of relationship between parts, and even layout.
Yeah.
And if I may say, what's your dynamic take on typology?
Right. Wow. Okay, let's see where we start with that one. I should qualify what I said about Frank's case, Gehry's buildings. When I say static, I don't mean necessarily in the kind of archigram building movement sort of scenario. I don't mean that the building. What I mean is that there's a kind of the use of materials, the notion of, if you look at Frank's work in some respects, there's very traditional fenestration, very traditional paneling. The plinths of his buildings for me are Nizam again, his student, we went by his tower in New York yesterday, she says, look at this building at the bottom, it's brick and square windows and, it's super kind of static, I guess, in that sense. But that carries up into the actual forms, right? Rather, what I guess I'm talking about, and it goes back to the B-scape, I-scape, texture mapping work we did early on, is that I think there's a way to produce certain kinds of sensorial effects and qualities of space that are dynamic by virtue of perception, by virtue of for example, on the wing house, it's called a wing house, by the way, the Finland. On the wing house, the idea that it can snow and rain and deflect light through oculi at the center will produce a series of spectral effects in the house itself. Many of these things are, difficult to represent, but it's what we kind of look to produce. What's interesting about the experiments that we have ran full course, like the Hydropier, this project in Abu Dhabi, and a couple of other buildings that are built by us, is that they all do, when you visit the actual buildings, they produce these kinds of conditions of liquidity and flux that you don't necessarily see in the photographs or even in film footage. This stuff is not, you can't get it kind of across that way. One of the things we kind of pride ourselves on is that our buildings look better in reality than any rendering we've done, right? I think most architects see the other way around. It's like, nice rendering, what is that? But I think that So a lot of it I guess a lot of that has to do with the transference of what it is you do to the way you perceive what it is, its perception, right? And the way it alters. And then what I said earlier about the fact that we have different spatial realities today than previous generations, because the space is being aberrated, is being changed by virtue of the way we coexist in this space, right? We coexist very differently in terms of our references, our geometries, right, and so on. So I think that it's rooted really in the experiential, and a part of that is material, part of that is haptic, part of that is the way things are, referencing, what materials are being referenced. I mean, Frank is a classicist in many ways. He's referencing materials and classical rules, which I think is very interesting, but it's not.
But if I may ask, would you agree that the layouts of these buildings are static? Yeah, of the house and of the tower, that they are static?
Well, okay, to be truthful, I hated the plans when we did them, okay, originally. The weird little plans we did for that building. But as soon as we produced...
I actually appreciate the quality of being static. Okay.
Oh, you like static?
Well, depending on what it is, yes.
Yeah, I agree. No, I want to show you something, if I can get back here. Okay, there. So when we first produced these, I was a bit nervous, honestly, about their static quality being somewhat boring. Was that? Classical, yeah. I was a bit nervous. But it wasn't until we actually did this that I realized that we were achieving something. Because yes, I guess it's static, if that's the word, but there's a dynamism to, I mean, I had to convince our clients that they didn't need level floors, which is kind of a hard thing to convince a client. But the fact that we could actually produce warped surfaces and that the spaces, and then again, it's a visceral thing. If you're moving on a surface that's changing in its kind of pitch or its an amplitude in terms of your body reference, I mean, it goes back to the running the pirouettes in the American Pavilion. There's a body engagement in architecture which I find fascinating and very powerful to try and decipher and work, and that helps liquefy it. It helps make it dynamic. It makes it helps change it and mutate it. So yes, the idea that in this case that you have stairs carved into the steeper surfaces, of shallower surfaces, and so the experience of the space, I think, would be dynamic, I suppose.
It can help you feel a bit more at ease with the word stasis. I mean, the concept of stasis doesn't necessarily mean rest and stop.
Okay.
There is always a parameter of dynamism. And the fact that there is, I cannot remember the name, but there is a colleague of yours that is working exactly on the concept of stasis as not being static.
I see.
Yeah.
I see.
Which brings your differences.
Yeah, because it would imply that something has been in movement, and
Right.
then you feel like it has that passive movement and potential as well. But I think also one thing to note here is that, because I've built quite a lot of pavilions, like usually like Atlas, like building pavilions, and there's a painting in the bottom, but this
You must be Canadian. And in the bum.
No. My defense is 5 years in London. This, in comparison to the tower, has come from actually like a one-to-one artifact and being scaled up, right? Whereas the tower in its intentionality is from the birth of the reality of the design process, a tower, right? So there's that kind of difference in scale, and maybe that might explain more.
No, that's true.
This was originally, for the Venice.
Right. Well, no. This was originally a car body
Yeah.
that was then thrown into Documenta and
like
then
recontextualized.
landed in Venice, and then
Yeah.
it's been on a long journey.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. It's always been a kind of deciphering or rereading of the object, and its latent dynamism or stasis. I am really happy to be here. You guys are going to educate me. This is great. I think actually, what I'd like to do is listen to you all tomorrow and take notes. But Anyway, it's an ongoing. I mean, if you see some of the stuff we're doing now, I was going to show. Actually, the last project I was going to show, I didn't decide not to, was a master plan we just did in China for a city for 50,000 people, and that's part of it. It's 50,000 housing. The rest of it is it's a totally crazy project, but. I didn't know how to talk about it, but I may show it. Yeah, if I can.
Can you show it tomorrow morning?
Yeah, maybe. If I can find it. I'm having trouble finding things on this drive. But yeah, or maybe I'll get a slip from the office. But yeah, it's still, I have to find out if they'll let me show it because we just finished and we just had it presented in China. But it's also interesting because it's the next tier of digital work for us because we're working with these Silicon Valley technologists with auto-driving cars, robotic. The buildings are all robotically controlled. Everything's delivered by robots. The infrastructure is all robotically. It's kind of mind-blowing when we started working with these guys on this, but they're very serious and it's a kind of interesting future. And so the idea was to bring to this highly dynamic master plan a semblance of form and place and so on. So it's pretty interesting. I mean, it's.
I guess a matter of interest. Are you still working in Farms 1 or like in the pavilion or smaller pavilion?
We haven't in a while. I wouldn't mind again, but we haven't. I'm waiting for the serpentine to call us. Finally get around to it. They're going backwards, but it's okay. No, we're too old for the young architect thing in PS1, and we don't seem to be established enough for serpentines. No, it's interesting you asked that. Like, it's just there was something in our office. Oh yeah, we just got invited to a piece of Milan for the next Mobili Fiera or whatever it is. Yeah, so I guess we said yes to it 2 days ago to Gilda and Interni. So yeah, I guess we're going to build something. You want to work on it with us? I mean, I'm curious what we would. It's interesting questions. Now that I've given this talk and put this, I mean, I told you when I put this together, I hadn't looked at a lot of this stuff in a long time. So I'm going, wait a minute, how does this all fit together? Does it fit together? But to do now, it's interesting having given this, having just accepted to do a pavilion. I wonder, yeah, it's an interesting question. What do we do in the next iteration of this stuff?
Yeah, because going back to what you were talking about, like Tremelo and columns, it allows you to actually test those things out in a much more agile way at that scale as well.
Well, that's how we got into it. I mean, right out of school, out of grad school, I built an installation. I got invited actually by Liz Diller. It was very nice. She saw me I was working with Libeskind on the Triennale in Milan, in the Progetto Domestico, and I built that piece for him. He never showed up. And then I ended up meeting Liz and Rick at that opening, and Liz said, "This is very beautiful. What is this thing?" I said, "I'm building it for this guy. You don't know him?" She said, "Oh, I know him." And I said, "But what about your work? What's your work like?" I said, "Well, this is my work actually." And then I showed her more work, and I said, "Well, why don't you have a show in New York?" So I had a show at Artist Space, and that's how. And it was installation. And so we started really building installations early on because it was between that and teaching was the only way to sustain ourselves. There were no commissions coming. But you're right. I always saw it as the perfect laboratory for architects. In fact, I was always amazed that more architects don't build abstract spatial installation pieces because it's really the place where you can. And there seems to be now a generation coming again, which is really nice to see. But there was a lull there for a while, and it was sort of frowned upon or something for a little while there. But I think it's coming back. I mean, there's a nice piece built on Governor's Island I saw yesterday, and there's another nice piece done. They're beginning to. The piece in PS1 is not so bad. So yeah. But I do think it's an amazing venue for young architects and perhaps older ones. I mean, I think it should be something we keep on doing.
Another pragmatic question, then professionally and logistically, how does it work for you guys to be based in New York and have all of the projects on a different continent?
Yeah, and never get a project in New York.
Or in the US?
Well, we built. No, what was nice, and this is the extension of the installation issue. We did get commissioned. This is a true story. I was in Vienna with Hans Hohlein, drinking at the American Bartolo Square. He says, "Do you want to go see my stores?" I go, "Yeah, let's do that." So we do this walk around Vienna, and we go to the couple of the ones that are left. And the week I got back to New York, we got a call to do a store for a Brazilian fashion designer, and so in the meatpacking district. And so I immediately said, absolutely, let's do this. You know, at that time, we had actually said early in our career, we will never do stores or houses in the Hamptons. This was our motto. Asymptote, never a store, never a house in the Hamptons. But you know, after seeing Holine and seeing how those were scale models of much larger stories, and having lived in Milan on Via Circo, where I lived for a couple of years, there was down on Via Torino is Bramante San Spirito. And I used to go there like as an architectural pilgrimage just to see the perspectival, sort of the back of the building and then look at the detailing. And then I realized it was a scale model for St. Peter's. So I thought, the next step from installations is store design, interiors, if they're done as architecture, not as interior design. So we set out to do the Miele store. It was quite successful, I don't know if you know it, and it worked very well. And then we did the Alessi store. And both those stores are still there. Alessi just got refurbished, which is amazing to me because these things usually get gutted after 3 years. So they've actually stayed put as kind of architectural experiments. So that's what we got to do in New York. And then we got to do also Perry Street building, glass building, which is quite nice next to Richard Meyer's. But yeah, you're right. We situate ourselves globally, I guess, by default. And as we're of a generation that basically has kind of fallen in step with technological shifts. So, Skype, I just had a 7-person Skype conference in Korea 2 days ago, which was, that should have been just recorded as some kind of Dada film because there's all these Korean guys screaming at each other and there's all these heads on the screen and I'm like, and it was for a project we're doing there. And so yeah, between Skype conference calling, the lucidity and quickness of data transferring, BIM modeling. BIM is amazing in terms of how it's changed the way we think construction and building. So it's all happening as we change and grow. And that's also why this anticipation thing is so interesting because we kind of, when we took the name Asymptote, for example, here's a good one. I remember I was sitting in Milan trying to figure out a name for a studio I wanted to start. And I looked around and I was like, okay, the groups I respect is Himmelblatt, Morphosis. If I go back further, Archigram, UFO, Archizoom. I'm going, okay, we need a name like that, right? Something really. And then I read this thing that Mr. Eastman had come up with the name Kodak by interviewing he had all these experts, marketing guys, and he said, okay, I need a name that can be pronounced in every language and means nothing whatsoever. Find me that name. And they came up with Kodak. So I sat there and I go, I need a name that means everything and cannot be pronounced in any language. So Asymptote. And it was mathematical, of course, and had a lot of resonance. But it really was already from the get-go a problematic decision to choose a name like that because it either, it wasn't KPF or it wasn't, some kind of nice, it's very weird. People don't know how to pronounce it. I sit in client meetings in Korea and they have the weirdest pronunciations of it. So, we've abbreviated it to ASY, which stands for Abercrombie Samuels and Yolanda, our cleaning woman. That's worked very well for us at times. It's true confession. ASY. But yeah, no, it's. I think it's working in tandem with. It goes back to the curiosity factor. I think the fact that we've moved with the technologies and allowed us to sort of somehow in some strange way we are asymptotically moving along the trajectory of technology and the empowerment of being able to work globally at the same time.
We have never feel you don't have enough control over the projects, constructing firms, the way they're building,
Yeah, we have a lot of those, but I think the thing is that we're definitely not very romantic about the discipline. So we don't we don't get super depressed when we can't control everything. But at the same time, it's very difficult. You're absolutely right. We just built a building in Korea, in Daegu, and they cut us out of the equation in the last 2 months. So when I visited for the ribbon cutting ceremony, I I almost had a cardiac. I looked around the details and I thought, oh my God, what did you guys do to this building? And so I made a giant fuss. And luckily, I think what helps us is our reputation. And the last thing the Koreans wanted was to lose face and have me kind of take my name off the building and do some crazy theatrics. So they closed it, they gutted it, they did it all over, and to our spec. But yeah, that's the renegade way of doing it.